Hello everyone, today we're going to get into the 1960s, so we're going to look at the John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson administration. Now, John F. Kennedy is elected president in 1960, and the 1960s are kind of seen as the high point of American liberalism. This is probably the greatest period of liberal reform since the New Deal. A lot of civil rights laws gets passed, Medicare gets passed, the Great Society and the War on Poverty take place. So 1960s, the high point of liberalism. But fast forward to 1968, and liberalism is in disarray. John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, and Martin Luther King Jr. have all been assassinated. Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was Kennedy's successor, decides to not seek re-election in 1968 because things are going so bad for him with the Vietnam War. The Democrats have their national convention that year in Chicago, and violence breaks out as protesters and police battle in the streets. So the 1960s is both the high point and the low point of liberalism, but we're going to start off by looking at John F. Kennedy and his administration. Now, John F. Kennedy was born in Massachusetts on May 29th of 1917. His father was Joseph P. Kennedy, who was a wealthy businessman and administrator for FDR. Now, JFK had a very privileged upbringing. His family had numerous homes around the nation in places like Hyannisport and Palm Beach. There were servants and maids who looked after the children. There are stories about JFK not really cleaning up after himself because he expected the maids to kind of do his laundry and wash his dishes. But despite his privileged upbringing, JFK also had a number of health problems growing up. As a child, he almost died of scarlet fever. He also had a bout with whooping cough. He also suffered from digestive ailments that would kind of follow him throughout his whole life. In his adult life, he would be diagnosed with Addison's disease, which is a disease of the adrenal glands. They don't work properly. So JFK has a lot of health problems. Now, he attends Choate, which is a private college preparatory boarding school in Connecticut. After he completes his time there, he moves on to Harvard. So he's at Harvard from 1936 to 1940, just as World War II is about to get started. Now, during that time, his father was the American ambassador to Great Britain, so his father's in London, and oftentimes JFK would be there as well. This gave JFK numerous chances to be in Europe as Hitler was marching the continent towards war. His father felt that Hitler couldn't be stopped and that the United States should stay out of the coming conflict, but JFK disagreed vehemently with his father. He went to the continent in 1939, just before the war broke out, to talk to people and gather information for his senior thesis. His senior thesis was called Appeasement at Munich, and it basically criticized England and the rest of Europe for not standing up to Hitler sooner. By the time he graduated, with the help of his father, this senior thesis was turned into the book Why England Slept, and it basically said the democracies needed to be armed better, they needed to be prepared to stop aggression, and they didn't do that, and that's why World War II started. So that's a really important lesson JFK learns as a young man. To prevent war, you need to be willing to stand up to aggression. Now, when the war breaks out, John F. Kennedy joins the Navy. His older brother, Joe Jr., was a pilot in England. He was actually kind of the star Kennedy child. A lot of people thought Joe Jr. was going to be the future president of the United States, not John F. Kennedy. But tragedy struck in August of 1944. Joe Jr. was on a bombing mission, and his plane blew up over England, and he was killed. Now, John F. Kennedy, like I said, joined the Navy, and he's eventually assigned command of PT-109, which is kind of a tactical vessel that patrols the Pacific. In the spring of 1943, he was assigned to the Solomon Islands. Now, the PT boats mostly raided Japanese supply convoys, so they didn't see a lot of action, at least not on the front lines. But one night, a Japanese destroyer hit their boat and cut it in two. Some of JFK's crew were killed and others were badly injured. The survivors floated in the water for some time before swimming to an island 3 miles away. JFK helped a wounded man by putting a cord from his life preserver in his own mouth and pulling him to that island 3 miles away, so JFK kind of saves this man. Eventually, JFK and his crew were rescued. They came home as war heroes, especially John F. Kennedy. His father used his connections to encourage the press to write positive stories about him. Now, after the war is when JFK gets into politics. He runs for the House of Representatives in 1946, and he wins that election. He serves in the House from 1947 to 1953. Now, JFK was immature and irresponsible when it came to his responsibilities in Washington. He did not take his job seriously. He spent more time going to the movies and chasing girls than he did as working as a representative. During his first term, another tragedy strikes the family. His sister Kathleen died in a plane crash in France, and JFK is also diagnosed with Addison's disease. So after these events, he kind of starts taking his responsibilities more seriously. Although he still chased girls and was a playboy, that's something he would do for the rest of his life. Now, he used his father's money to take a couple of trips in 1951 around the world. He visited many developing nations such as Israel, Iran, Pakistan, India, Singapore, Thailand, French Indochina, Korea, and Japan. Some of these are advanced places, but they're kind of up-and-coming nations. He ends up going on Meet the Press and does an interview, and he basically argues that America needs to forge alliances with these new developing nations. JFK saw the next phase of the Cold War as taking place in the Third World, and he felt that America needed to be on the side of those seeking independence from their colonizers. So one of the quotes that he gives on this interview, I want to read it. He says this. He says, "Well, we've tied ourselves completely with the French, and after all, the natives are anxious. You can never defeat the communist movement in Indochina until you get the support of the natives, and you won't get the support of the natives as long as they feel the French are fighting the communists in order to hold on to their own power there." So JFK says we should side with those seeking independence, not necessarily with the French, just because they're our allies and because they're strongly anti-communist. Now, in 1952, JFK decides to run for the Senate. He defeats the incumbent Republican Senator Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., whose father was the guy that frustrated Woodrow Wilson so much. JFK wins another term in 1958, so he serves as the senator from Massachusetts from 1953 to 1961. Now, while he's senator, he marries Jacqueline Lee Bouvier. The two were married in September of 1953. They would remain married until JFK's death in 1963. They had 4 children altogether. One of them was stillborn, and another one died within a couple of days after being born. So they also experienced tragedy. Now, their marriage was happy at times, but JFK was a notorious womanizer. A friend had actually warned Jackie before the marriage that he was a womanizer and that he probably wasn't going to change his ways or change his behavior. He had affairs with many women, from a 19-year-old intern at the White House to the movie star Marilyn Monroe. He arranged for the Secret Service to bring prostitutes to him at different points. There's even orgies that he had at the White House and other places. If you kind of want to read about any of this stuff, there's a great book called The Dark Side of Camelot by the journalist Seymour M. Hersh. Lots of stories. JFK was he was a womanizer. That's the politest way to put it. But back into politics, in the Senate, he clashes with another senator who will be famous later on, Lyndon Baines Johnson. LBJ thought JFK was an upstart who got where he was because of his father's money. He openly ridiculed JFK in front of others and didn't believe JFK took his responsibilities seriously, and most of that is true. The two clashed in 1960. Both of them wanted to be the Democrat nominee for president. In the end, JFK won the nomination. He had traveled the country campaigning while LBJ stayed in the Senate and did his work, took his responsibilities seriously. But it turns out the voters wanted somebody who was fresh and who kind of had that movie star appeal, and that was JFK. Now, Kennedy knew that he couldn't win without winning states like Texas or other southern states. You know, Kennedy is a northeastern Democrat. He's from Massachusetts. He might not be trusted in the South. So he asks LBJ to be his vice presidential running mate so that he can get more help in the South. LBJ agrees to this. So the two kind of hated each other. I would say Lyndon Johnson hated Kennedy more than Kennedy hated Johnson. Lyndon Johnson really hated Kennedy's brother, Bobby Kennedy. Those two hated each other with a passion. Now, the election of 1960 saw John F. Kennedy taking on the Vice President Richard Nixon. Now, they had some similarities in their backgrounds. They're both born in the 20th century. Eisenhower is the last president that was born in the 19th century. So these two were born in the 20th century. They both served in the Navy in World War II. They were both elected to Congress in 1946 and then to the Senate in the 1950s. Both are known as anti-communist crusaders, but they also had some not so similar backgrounds. JFK was the son of a wealthy businessman. His father was ambassador to England. He attended Harvard, had the best education, had the best things life could offer. Nixon was the son of a poor father who struggled to survive. Nixon actually had a chance to go to some of those colleges like Yale and Harvard, but he had to turn them down because he had to stay home and help his family who was struggling financially. So he ends up going to the local college in the California town where he lived. So he basically gave up this fancy Eastern education to help his family. That's one reason why he probably never trusted the Eastern intellectuals that kind of ran the government. Now, what made 1960 so interesting is that there were 4 televised presidential debates. So these are the first TV debates in American history. The first debate took place and 70 million people watched. Now, Nixon had been in the hospital previously. He had been sick. He'd been campaigning a lot, so Nixon is very tired and exhausted. Kennedy had been campaigning out in California. He appeared tan, but he had also been resting the few days before the debate. So basically, when you looked at the debate on TV, people said Kennedy won because of the way he looked. They might not have known that's why he won, but people that were polled and watched the debate said Kennedy was the winner. But people who listened on the radio, they said Nixon won the debate. Now, Nixon is a champion debater. He's an intellectual. He's probably much smarter than Kennedy, so people thought Nixon should have won. But TV said Kennedy won, Nixon won on the radio. Now, the election is really, really close. Kennedy gets 49.7% of the vote. Nixon gets 49.5% of the vote. Something like 120,000 votes separate the two candidates. Many historians and people at the time believe that the election was stolen from Nixon. Mayor Richard Daley of Chicago and Lyndon Johnson and his cronies in Texas, it's believed they delivered the states of Illinois and Texas to Kennedy when maybe they actually went for Nixon. Nixon thought about contesting the election, but basically the Republicans told him, don't contest the election, you'll look like a sore loser. So with those two states, Kennedy wins the election. If they had flipped, Nixon would have won. JFK wins the black vote, he wins the Catholic vote, and he wins the labor vote. Now, Kennedy's inaugural is very famous. In his inaugural, he said, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. A lot of his inaugural address was about foreign policy. Now, one of the most famous things he said was this: let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty. Now, that was a shot at Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev had recently said that he would support wars of national liberation. So places like Vietnam, he would support the Vietnamese fighting the French against colonial rule. Now, JFK selects a lot of the best and the brightest to kind of be advisors and be in his cabinet. He picks Dean Rusk for the Secretary of State, Charles Douglas Dillon as Secretary of the Treasury, Clarence Douglas Dillon for Treasury, Robert McNamara as Secretary of Defense, his brother Robert Kennedy as Attorney General, and Allen Dulles to head the CIA. Clarence Douglas Dillon, Robert McNamara, and Allen Dulles were all Republicans, so he put some Republicans in some high positions in his administration. Now, JFK and many of these people came of age during the Great Depression, the New Deal, and World War II. So if you think about the Great Depression and World War II being two of the biggest challenges America faced in the 20th century, America conquered those challenges, overcame them. So basically, Kennedy and his advisors grow up in an age when America experienced some really tough times and overcame them. So it almost gave them this sense of America can accomplish anything. The writer David Halberstam famously called Kennedy and his advisors the best and the brightest. So this was an age in the 1960s when we put the best people in government, and hopefully the results would follow. Now, JFK differed from Eisenhower regarding foreign policy. If you remember, Eisenhower's new look had relied upon massive retaliation, sort of an all-or-nothing approach. Use nuclear weapons to go to the brink of war and make your enemy back down. That was the most cost-effective way Eisenhower believed to do things. JFK's policy is called flexible response. It's a defense policy in which the U.S. can have either a nuclear or a conventional response. So like Eisenhower's new look focused on nuclear weapons and was, like I said, cost effective. But JFK's flexible response requires more money to fund a conventional military force. So JFK actually increases defense spending. JFK said that the United States must be prepared to, quote, deter all wars, general or limited, nuclear or conventional, large or small. So JFK kind of has all of the above approach. Now, he also placed a larger emphasis on fighting and winning the Cold War in the Third World. He believes that the future of the Cold War is in the Third World, so America must defeat communism there. Previous administrations thought that though they worked with leaders from the Third World, they had more of a Europe first strategy, so Kennedy changes that. I've got a quote I want to read from a speech he gave. Kennedy says, "The great battleground for the defense and expansion of freedom today is the whole southern half of the globe, Asia, Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East, the lands of the rising people. Their revolution is the greatest in human history." So let's focus on winning the Cold War in these places. Now, JFK gets off to a really bad start with his administration with something called the Bay of Pigs invasion. Now, the communist Fidel Castro had taken power in Cuba in 1959. He had ousted a man named Batista, who was kind of a dictator. Castro nationalizes billions of dollars in American assets. He's viewed as a communist menace in the Caribbean by the United States. Eisenhower had placed a trade embargo on Cuba. He had also began plans to use the CIA to train Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro. Now, these rebels were trained in Guatemala by the CIA. So there's this plan to oust Castro. When JFK becomes president, he inherits these plans. The CIA tells him that this will be an easy operation. We'll overthrow Castro, piece of cake. So JFK green lights the invasion, but he does so after limiting American support for the invasion, including vital air support. JFK was worried about the invasion being connected to the United States if the air power is used, and then the whole world would condemn the United States for meddling in another country's affairs. He wanted this overthrow to look like a spontaneous uprising by exiled Cuban rebels. So on April 15th, the air campaign over Cuba commenced. It was led by American bombers that were disguised as Cuban planes. They took off from Nicaragua and bombed Cuban airfields, but they didn't really wipe out the Cuban Navy or the Cuban Air Force. The next day, about 1,400 Cuban exiles hit the beaches at the Bay of Pigs. JFK did not allow the nearby air support, the United States air support, to aid them, and the Cuban government quickly pins them down on the beaches and destroys their supplies, destroy their landing craft. About 1,200 of the Cuban exiles were killed or captured. So this Bay of Pigs invasion is a total failure. Castro is not overthrown. America, everyone knows America is behind it, and it's just a really embarrassing moment for JFK. Now, JFK is about to go to Vienna to meet with the Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, so he kind of has a black eye when he goes to meet with the communist leader of the world. So in June of 1961, they have something called the Vienna Summit. JFK and Khrushchev talk about Berlin. They talk about suspending nuclear testing. They talk about decelerating the Cold War arms race. They really wanted to pull back the Cold War, but Khrushchev basically ran roughshod over JFK. Khrushchev thought he could have his way with JFK. You know, JFK is a young, inexperienced playboy. He doesn't know how to be president. JFK was also in a lot of pain. He had back pain from his Addison's disease from the medicine he was taking to kind of counter that. So he's in a lot of pain. He doesn't have his A game. So the meeting is generally seen from the American point of view as a failure. That might not be fair. Who knows how much you can really get out of these talks, but that's how people view it at the time, as a failure. Later that summer, Khrushchev resumes nuclear testing, which is something JFK warned him not to do. Later in June, Khrushchev isolates East Berlin from West Berlin. Now, JFK responds by sending more troops to Europe. Khrushchev backs off his threats to expel the U.S. and NATO from West Berlin, but in August 1961, construction begins on the Berlin Wall. First, barbed wire goes up, but later the communists start using concrete. And I want you to watch this little video clip showing people trying to escape the Berlin Wall.
As the communist barrier between East and West Berlin grows higher and stronger, the more determined grows the will of those in the East to escape. Along the border, East Berliners are forced to evacuate their homes as the communist police move to prevent their escape. Camera crews are harassed by reflecting mirrors in the hands of East German police, and water hoses are played on equipment. Nevertheless, our reporters are able to come up with some remarkable pictures despite these hazards. Smoke and tear gas bombs sometimes boomerang on the East German troops. It's like a deadly game of badminton. East Berliners who have apartments facing the border take the long chance when they get orders to leave their homes for the interior. While an East German guard attempts to yank her back to prison, West Berliners pull her to a fire net and freedom. Heedless of danger, from 4th and 5th floor windows, from any hatchway open to escape, they flee. This woman drops into a net held by alerted firemen. And then, as a tense crowd watches, she is followed by her husband. But first, he throws out a few prized possessions. Determined to protect their people from such temptations, the East Germans are razing homes and buildings along the border and creating a 10-foot ditch to prevent autos and trucks from crashing the barrier. The East Germans don't seem to have guards enough to plug every hole. When a soldier's attention is diverted by others, a hole is cut in the barbed wire and Khrushchev's face is slapped again. Camera can capture but a few isolated instances of these heroic escapes, but enough to present a remarkable document of our time. Remember, these people are risking their very lives to taste something we too often take for granted: liberty. At times, the border guards seem to make but half-hearted attempts to stop their fleeing countrymen. They never use their guns within camera range, though there have been many reports of shootings. Maybe someday they too hope to sample the sweet taste of freedom.
People in West Berlin were very fearful after the wall started being built. They were worried, are we going to be conquered by the communists, by the Russians? So JFK responds by sending armored columns of American troops through East Germany by way of the Autobahn to West Berlin to basically show, hey, we're still with you, West Berlin. We will never let you be conquered. We will never give you up. JFK also sends Lyndon Johnson and General Lucius Clay to Berlin to show solidarity. This is when the famous standoff at Checkpoint Charlie occurs. Basically, the Americans and the Russians both put tanks right along the border of East and West Berlin. So there's this tank standoff in August of 1961. If somebody accidentally fires a shot, it might start World War III. American bombers are on standby. American troops around the world are on alert. Some people think this might start World War III, but eventually tensions kind of de-escalate. Both sides don't want to start World War III over Berlin, so little by little the tanks back up and the situation kind of de-escalates. But Berlin is a problem for both the United States and for the Soviet Union and for the world, I guess you could say, if it leads to nuclear war. For the West, Khrushchev always called Berlin the testicles of the West, so anytime he wants to put pressure on the Western countries, he just squeezes a little bit in Berlin or does some funny business in Berlin. For the East, for the communists, the problem with Berlin is people are always leaving through Berlin. One German citizen said this: all you had to do was board a subway or a surface train and you were in another world. You could go from socialism to capitalism in 2 minutes. And basically, Berlin is a great place to see the two different competing ideologies side by side, capitalism and socialism. In West Berlin, you have capitalism and you have freedom, you have democracy, the economy flourishes. In East Berlin, you have socialism, you have dictatorship, the economy flounders. So it's not really a good comparison, and the communists know this, and so do the people of Berlin. So a lot of people flee East Germany through East Berlin. So they go to East Berlin, they get papers, they go to West Berlin, and then from West Berlin they're allowed to go to West Germany or other Western countries that are not behind the Iron Curtain. So by the end of 1956, 1 million people have left East Germany. By the end of 1961, 2.7 million people have fled East Germany through Berlin. So basically, from the 1940s up until the 1960s, the population of East Germany has fallen by over 2 million people, by over 3 million people maybe. Now, the Soviets and the East Germans, the communists, they know that this is not good. One Soviet government official said this: our Marxist-Leninist theory must prove itself in the GDR, that's East Germany. It must be demonstrated that what the capitalists and the renegades say is wrong. Another Soviet official said this: the presence in Berlin of an open and essentially uncontrolled border between the socialist and capitalist worlds unwittingly prompts the population to make a comparison between both parts of the city, which unfortunately does not always turn out in favor of the democratic East Berlin. So basically, the Soviets know that people are comparing socialism and capitalism and they're fleeing to the capitalist places. Khrushchev did not want to build the wall, but he saw that as the only way to stop the flow of people out of East Germany. He said this: the wall was a hateful thing, but what should I have done? More than 30,000 people, in fact the best and most qualified people from the GDR, left the country in July. The East German economy would have collapsed if we hadn't done something soon against the mass flight, so the wall was the only remaining option. Now, John F. Kennedy kind of poked back and said, we never had to put up a wall to keep our people in, to prevent them from leaving us. So JFK knows that capitalism is way better than socialism. Now, JFK has a lot of other foreign policy initiatives. I'm not really going to get into them, but he establishes the Peace Corps. Basically, volunteers agree to spend a couple years abroad teaching English or doing things like digging wells or building villages. Basically, the Peace Corps is a way to help alleviate poverty, but it's also a way to show that capitalism is better than communism, better than socialism. It's a way to get the third world on the side of the capitalist nations. The State Department has something called the Agency for International Development. Basically, it's foreign aid for the third world. There's something called Food for Peace. There's a big project called the Alliance for Progress. It's basically a 10-year plan for the Americas. Something like $20 billion is pumped into the Latin American economies to kind of help prop them up. So JFK does a lot of stuff foreign policy related, but the most important thing he's known for is the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, this is the most intense moment of his administration, and it's probably the year, or it's supposedly the year, that the world came closest to nuclear war. So this 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis happens. Now, after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, JFK authorized something called Operation Mongoose, which was the attempt by the CIA to assassinate Fidel Castro. Bobby Kennedy oversaw Operation Mongoose. So the CIA is trying to kill Castro. In the spring of 1962, 40,000 American soldiers invade one of the islands of Puerto Rico in basically a mock invasion to see if they can carry out an invasion of a Caribbean island. Now, the Americans had intended this to be a distraction for Castro. Castro was working to spread revolution through other Caribbean islands and kind of Latin America. So the Americans do this mock invasion with these 40,000 troops just to kind of distract Castro, make him think that maybe we're going to invade Cuba, so maybe you just need to focus on your own defenses. But Cuba sees this as a practice run for an actual invasion of Cuba. So JFK's actions at the Bay of Pigs, Operation Mongoose, and this mock invasion basically convinced the Soviets that they have to do something to protect Castro. So JFK's actions kind of drive Castro and the Russians together. Now, they were already together, but he kind of puts them more so together. So just keep in mind that Kennedy does get credit for ending the Cuban Missile Crisis, but he also helped create it. So basically what ends up happens is the Russians agree to put missiles on Cuba to help protect it. So in July of 1962, Soviet ships with nuclear missiles, about 150 ships, start sailing to Cuba, and these ships have over 40,000 Russian soldiers on them. So not only do Russian missiles, nuclear missiles, get put in Cuba, but 40,000 Russian soldiers do as well. Now, Khrushchev basically did this for three reasons. One is he did it to protect Castro in Cuba. Two, he thought that he could help spread communism in Latin America. If there's missiles on Cuba, Cuba's this show of force. It's basically showing the communists in other parts of the Western Hemisphere, hey, there's a superpower behind you. You can spread communism and we'll support you. Khrushchev also, thirdly, wanted to restore the balance of power. He said this: "The fate of Cuba and the maintenance of Soviet prestige in that part of the world preoccupied me. We had to think in some way of confronting America with more than words. We had to establish a tangible and effective deterrent to American interference in the Caribbean. But what exactly? The logical answer was missiles." Now, I want to back up and go to Europe for a second. NATO has about 5,000 nuclear weapons aimed at the Soviet Union all throughout Europe. This includes Jupiter missiles that have recently been put in Turkey. So basically, Khrushchev wants to restore the balance of power by putting missiles in Cuba. American missiles in Europe can take out Moscow, can take out major Soviet cities very quickly. But Russian missiles can't really make it to the United States, and if they can, it's going to take a lot longer. So basically, America can attack Russia with nuclear weapons very quickly, but Russia, the Soviet Union, cannot do the same to America. So if these missiles are in Cuba, all of a sudden the United States is in play for a communist nuclear missile attack, and it's like it evens the odds from the communist perspective. So the United States does not know about the missiles, but they do know about these increased amount of ships coming from the Soviet Union to Cuba. So the United States sends a U-2 plane over Cuba on October 14th, 1962 to take pictures and see what's going on. On October 15th, the pictures are analyzed and it's discovered that SS-4 ballistic missile sites are being built on Cuba, missile sites that can house nuclear missiles. JFK is informed of this the next day on October 16th, 1962. So, kind of like I said earlier, the problem with these missiles in Cuba is they make America within reach of a nuclear strike. And this nuclear strike is going to be a first strike. Basically, a first strike is when you take out the bombers, the missile bases, and the major cities and then limit that country's ability to retaliate with a counterstrike. So now the Soviet Union can hit American bomber, missile sites before America could have a chance to retaliate. So this is a big deal. This totally shifts the balance of power in the Cold War. JFK puts together something called the Executive Committee, and they basically discuss what they should do. They talk about attacking Cuba with airstrikes, wipe out the missile sites. They talk about invading Cuba with land forces. Let's just kick communism. Let's kick Castro out of Cuba. Won't be a problem anymore. They talk about diplomacy and continuing negotiations, or they talk about a quarantine of Cuba, which is basically a blockade. Let's just stop any more missiles from coming to Cuba. So they ultimately decide on that route. Kennedy goes before the nation on October 22nd, 1962. He explains what's happening. He explains that Russia has put nuclear missiles in Cuba, and he has a message for Khrushchev in this televised announcement, and this is what he says. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. So basically, if any missiles come from Cuba, we will attack the Soviet Union. Now, the world does come close to nuclear war. There's a U-2 plane that's shot down over Cuba. American ships are dropping depth charges on Russian submarines in the Caribbean. There's tactical nuclear weapons that are on Cuba that are just meant to be used against invading forces, and the Russian generals on the ground have the authority to use those, not Khrushchev. So if the Americans do land forces, maybe the commander on the ground in Cuba launches a tactical nuclear weapon, and if that goes off, America will probably nuke Cuba. So the world did come close to war. But what ended up happening is Khrushchev and Kennedy basically kind of resolved the situation through back channels. Basically, Bobby Kennedy met with the Soviet ambassador to Washington. Those two meet, and basically Russia agrees to take the missiles and the soldiers out of Cuba. JFK promises that the United States will not invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. And secretly, JFK promises to take the offensive missiles out of Turkey. Now, this part is kept secret. JFK does not allow Khrushchev to tell the whole world, hey, I got Kennedy to pull his missiles out of Turkey. So this part's kept secret. The result is that JFK looks tough on the world stage. He de-escalates the Cuban Missile Crisis. He makes Khrushchev back down. There was this myth that JFK had went eyeball to eyeball with Khrushchev. That's Secretary of State Dean Rusk's phrase, eyeball to eyeball, concerning the blockade. These Russian ships are coming towards the blockade, and Khrushchev tells the ships to continue on, and Kennedy tells the American ships to hold firm, and those two ships almost collided and started World War III. Well, it turns out that the Russian ships turn around before they even get within 500 nautical miles of the American blockade. So, 500 miles is not eyeball to eyeball. Eyeball to eyeball is like right next to each other. So that's kind of a myth. And basically what happens is the Russian ships, like I said, turn around. As a result, JFK looks really good. He invites reporters to the White House and tells them this stuff. He also demands to edit their stories to make himself look better. So JFK manipulates the press to basically help himself out politically. As a result, the Democrats hold the House and the Senate in the midterm elections. This happens in October 1962. The midterm elections are in November 1962. So Kennedy, maybe unfairly, kind of uses the press to make himself look better. One other thing that happens as a result is a hotline is installed between Washington and Moscow. That way, if there's ever a future conflict like this, Khrushchev and Kennedy, or whoever the leaders are, can talk directly to each other. Now, in the following year, in June of 1963, JFK gives a really famous speech at American University in Washington, D.C. He basically talks about nuclear weapons. He says, "Today, the expenditure of billions of dollars every year on weapons acquired for the purpose of making sure we never need them is essential to keeping peace. But surely the acquisition of such idle stockpiles, which can only destroy and never create, is not the only, much less most efficient means of assuring peace." So Kennedy and Khrushchev eventually negotiate an agreement on a nuclear test ban treaty a few weeks after this. So in July of 1963, they agree to a partial nuclear test ban treaty. So basically, let's not test nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. This is kind of a way to de-escalate the Cold War. Later in June 1963, JFK travels to West Berlin, the city that many people believed he'd helped save, and he gives his famous Ich bin ein Berliner speech. He talks about how Berlin is a representative of the freedom that the capitalist democratic countries want to preserve for the world. So he says, "We are with you, Berlin. We will never forget you. We will never leave you." Now, one big area of JFK's foreign policy that we're not going to discuss right now is Vietnam. We'll talk about Vietnam in a whole separate lecture, but just for now, I want you to know that JFK increased the number of American soldiers in Vietnam to about 16,000 by the time he's killed. They were technically advisors, but they did do a lot of fighting and dying. He also allowed a coup against the pro-American South Vietnamese leader Ngo Dinh Diem to take place on November 2nd, 1963. So right before Kennedy's assassinated, he allows the South Vietnamese ally Ngo Dinh Diem to be assassinated. The coup results in Diem's death, and it throws South Vietnam into political chaos, from which it never really recovers. So basically, in summary, just know that JFK increased America's presence in Vietnam because he felt it was a part of the world in which the United States needed to make a stand to stop communist aggression. Remember his experience prior to World War II in his book, Why England Slept. You can't let aggression win. You have to make a stand. You have to stop it somewhere. So we'll talk about Vietnam in a whole nother lecture. Now, JFK's kind of domestic policy, his presidency was referred to as the New Frontier. So as president, JFK is going to do a lot of things domestically, but he's mostly known as a Cold Warrior, spends most of his time on foreign policy. JFK accepts Keynesian deficit spending, which was the idea that the government should intentionally spend more money than it collects in order to stimulate the economy. But JFK also believes in cutting taxes. He said that, quote, "a rising tide lifts all boats." So he proposes huge tax cuts. They don't get passed when he's president, but they get passed in 1964 after he dies. Now, JFK does take action to raise the minimum wage and expand Social Security, but he doesn't really enlarge the New Deal nearly as much as his predecessor, Lyndon Baines Johnson, will, and we'll talk about that later. One thing that really does set JFK's New Frontier apart is his increased spending on space exploration and his call to put a man on the moon. In May of 1961, JFK gives a speech to a joint session of Congress. This is called his moonshot speech, but this is what he says. "Finally, if we are to win the battle that is now going on around the world between freedom and tyranny, the dramatic achievements in space which occurred in recent weeks should have made clear to us all, as did the Sputnik in 1957, the impact of this adventure on the minds of men everywhere who are attempting to make a determination of which road they should take. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth." So basically, Kennedy is saying there's a lot of people in the third world who don't know which side to take, the capitalist or socialist side. If we can show them that we're the ideology, the countries of the future, they'll pick our side. Putting a man on the moon will help us do that. Now, in May of 1961, Alan Shepard becomes the first American in space. In 1962, John Glenn mans the first space mission that orbits the Earth. And then finally, in 1969, the United States puts a man on the moon. So a lot of this is due to Kennedy. Now, John F. Kennedy does not take a strong stand on civil rights. He's actually a very poor president when it comes to civil rights. He does do something in 1960 to help him win the election. Martin Luther King Jr. had been arrested in 1960 and taken to prison. JFK did not issue a public statement, but he did call Martin Luther King Jr.'s wife, Coretta, and shared his concern. So he reaches out to her. Bobby Kennedy later made some phone calls that helped get Martin Luther King Jr. released from jail. Now, this helped deliver the black vote to JFK, but then once he becomes president, he basically ignores blacks. There's a lot of famous moments in the civil rights era that happened during his presidency. We'll talk about these in a whole lecture on civil rights, but I just want to mention what JFK did right now. In May of 1961, you had something called the Freedom Rides that took place. These were attempts to integrate interstate buses in the South after the Supreme Court had ruled segregated public transportation was unconstitutional. So what happens is blacks and whites will get on buses and they will sit contrary to what Southern laws and Southern customs dictate. So the whites will sit in back, the blacks will sit in front. When they stop in Southern cities and go to restaurants, blacks will go sit at the counter where they're not supposed to. So they basically challenge segregation as they drive throughout the South. This causes a reaction by segregationists in the South. In Anniston, Alabama, there was violence as pro-segregationists attacked the buses and the civil rights campaigners. One of the buses is firebombed. JFK is preparing for his summit with Nikita Khrushchev in Vienna at this point. He doesn't want America's race problems to be an embarrassment while he's on the world stage. So what JFK does is he tells the protesters to knock it off. He says, we can't protect you on these rides. I won't send the federal government to protect you. So, just stop doing this. It's an embarrassment. Basically, wait your turn. In April 1963, the Birmingham campaign took place. Birmingham, Alabama is considered the most segregated city in America by a lot of people. Blacks go there and they protest the discrimination. The Commissioner of Public Safety, Eugene Bull Connor, unleashes police dogs and fire hoses on these protesters. The scene is broadcast to the whole nation. JFK does eventually send 3,000 federal marshals to the city to kind of keep the peace, but he doesn't really do a whole lot more. On June 11th, 1963, the segregationist governor, George Wallace of Alabama, he makes his famous stand in the doorway of the school at the University of Alabama to block integration. So the University of Alabama is supposed to accept black students. George Wallace stands in the door and says, I don't want to do this. It's a real famous picture and clip. Later that night, JFK does go before the nation and he does talk about civil rights. So this is the real first strong stance JFK has taken. He says, we are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is old as the scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities. So what JFK does is he asks Congress to pass a National Civil Rights Act to basically end segregation throughout the country, mostly in the South, but it does occur other places. So kind of towards the end of his presidency, he finally decides to act on civil rights, but by then it's too late. In November 22nd, 1963, John F. Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas, Texas. He had gone down there to campaign to kind of build support for his 1964 re-election campaign. Lee Harvey Oswald, a communist who had spent time in Cuba and the Soviet Union, shoots Kennedy to death. Now, Lee Harvey Oswald himself is assassinated a few days later while in police custody. So this has caused a never-ending series of conspiracy theories about the JFK assassination and whether or not Lee Harvey Oswald officially killed him. Now, officially, Lee Harvey Oswald did kill him, but a lot of people think it was somebody else or some other group of people, more than one person. So JFK is assassinated in November of 1963, and Lyndon Baines Johnson is sworn in as president. So next time we'll kind of look at how Johnson acts as president, and we'll kind of continue with the 1960s.